In this one, we are going to be installing Python 3.6 directly from python.org. This is the recommended way to do this. If you've installed Python in any other way, follow along with me, even if you think that you don't need to. Trust me, just stick with me on this one. Now, of course, this one's for macOS. So if you have a Windows, feel free to skip. If you're already really comfortable with Python and creating Python virtual environments, by all means, you can skip this portion as well. Now, for the rest of us, let's go ahead and even see if we have Python 3.6 on our machine, because you actually might. Now, to do this, we're going to go ahead and open up a program called Terminal. So if you go into Applications, scroll to the very bottom, and you're going to want to look for Utilities, and scroll to the very bottom of that. You're going to go ahead and open up this application called Terminal. Now, yours is probably not going to look like this if you've never opened your machine before. Instead, yours is probably going to look more something along these lines, maybe not with this special character. That's okay. It's still the same machine. It's still the same program. It's not really going to be that much different, so the commands are all going to be roughly the same. I just have mine more presentable for you. Now, to test if we have Python installed, we can type out Python on the command line here. So that's what the terminal is. It's a way to access the command line. So if I hit Python, it brings me into Python 2.7. Notice I hit enter, and now I'm in Python. How do I get out of this? There's several ways to do it. One of them is you could just close this window out. Another one is to hit Command N to open a new window and start a new session. And yet the preferred method of exiting out of Python is literally writing out exit with parentheses and then hit enter. That brings you out of the Python shell. Now, if I've already lost you on this, I feel like you probably need to get some more familiarity with Python itself prior to jumping into this one, as I mentioned in the requirements, but that's a good little litmus test on whether or not that's the case. So we can actually go ahead and do Python 3.6 on macOS. This is not true for other operating systems necessarily, but on macOS, if you do Python 3.6-V, hit enter, you should see something like this. The important parts here are Python 3.6, not 0.8. 0.8 is great, but that's not as important as 3.6. Okay, so if you have this, you're good. You can go. If you don't have this, if you see something more like if I did Python 33.6 and you get this command not found, we need to install Python 3.6. And then if you also see that if you do Python 3-V, as in no 0.6, and you have a different version of Python, well, you could totally use that. But the thing is, Python 3.9 is still a bit newer, and not every third-party package will support it. That's true for 3.7 and 3.8 as well, where 3.6 will have a lot more third-party package support. Django is such a third-party package, so you could totally use Django with 3.6 as well as many other packages. That's why I'm using 3.6. The other reason is to make sure we're all on the same page. So now let's go ahead and answer the question of how do we actually install Python 3.6, or what's the easiest way to do it? So if you go to python.org and go into downloads, click on downloads, you'll see a screen like this. Of course, if you clicked on Mac OS X, you could see a screen like this. So this is really the screen we want to get to. So if you click on downloads, just make sure you click on Mac OS X. And of course, this is the link right here, the actual URL. That might change over time. But the idea here is we want to find the installer version. And you'll have to make sure that you know what version of Mac you're on, if you're on an Intel Mac or the M1 Mac. The vast majority of you in the past would have been on the M1 Mac, the Intel Mac. So there will be a difference on that. Hopefully not too much of one. But what I want to do here is I want to search with Command F 3.6. So what I want to find is actual files for the particular release. Notice that 3.6.14 is out, and it came out in June 28th of 2021, but it doesn't have an actual installer on here. So if I just keep searching 3.6, eventually I'll find a version that has an installer. And of course, that's 3.6.8. Not surprisingly, that is the version I have on my machine. So what we see here is a 64-bit one and a 32-bit one. You can go off of the 64-bit one. It actually doesn't really matter which one you use. But notice that there is no version for the Intel version of Mac. That's because this one is not compiled for the M1 version of Mac. It's fun that all of these things change. But anyway, so let's go ahead and download the installer. Again, you can download either one. And we're just going to go ahead and open this up. And we're going to go ahead and install this, right? So a lot of good stuff here. And we really only need to accept all of the basics. And then, of course, you need to give it access to do so. Now, if you are on a machine that you don't own, if you're at a work computer, you're going to need to talk to your IT department. That would be true if you're a student as well that doesn't have their own computer and you need to install Python on it. This is where different versions of Python might already be on your machine and you might be able to use those. Or you could just go ahead and buy yourself a Raspberry Pi, literally a Raspberry Pi, and spend, $30 on one of those to get the correct version of Python. Even older versions of Raspberry Pi. Perhaps you might have to spend a bit more. That might be a worthwhile cause. But we can talk about that some other time, or let me know in the comments if you need some more advice there. But I'm going to go ahead and let this finish actually installing, and then we'll come right back. Okay, so it finished installing on my machine. And if you go back into applications, what you'll see is a version of Python in here, right? So notice I have several versions of Python. That is completely acceptable. You can totally use several versions of Python. So now let's go ahead and open up that terminal application again. So navigating to applications and then scrolling all the way down into utilities, into terminal. Let's go ahead and open up a new terminal window. So creating a new terminal session means that we will have access to this newly installed version of Python. If you didn't actually open up a new terminal window, you might not have access to that version. So if I do Python 3.6 now and then -v, I still see that Python 3.6. And I can also type out which Python 3.6, and it should give me a general indication of where this is installed. Now the installer does this for us. And of course, if I do which Python and then which Python 3, we're going to see a few different locations. These things we don't have to worry about at this time, right? The main thing is that if I type out Python 3.6-V, I see that version. If you do -v, you will enter the shell and it gives you a bunch of things that looks like an error. So let's go ahead and exit out of that. And now we need to do really the final step in our Python project setup. This is something you'll do with every Python project, in my opinion. You don't always have to do this, but the idea is when we install third-party packages for our Python projects, we need to isolate them from other Python projects that we have on our machine. This isolation is not really isolation, but it is at least giving us some sort of comfort that versions of packages and stuff aren't overriding each other, because that certainly can happen, as we'll see when we develop this a little bit more. So what I want to do is I want to create a folder or a directory where I'm going to store all of my development projects. And if I do make_dir or mkdir and then dev, that is a folder. So it's make directory, dev or dev. In my case, it already actually has one. And of course, again, if you're on a Mac computer and you type out open and period, that will actually open up the directory you are currently in, or the location you're in. Notice we haven't changed around directories at all. We will in a minute. But this is my main user. This user is CFE. That's the CFE user for this machine. And there is a folder in here called dev. Now, this folder already has a bunch of stuff, but if you just did this, yours doesn't have a bunch of stuff. It's empty, right? I'm probably telling you something you already know, but that's the case. So what we want to do is we want to change into that dev folder, and we can list things out with ls. So ls shows us what's inside of this folder. And what I see here is a bunch of different folders. We don't have to worry about that right now. Instead, what we have to worry about is making a brand new folder for our project. And this folder is going to be our virtual environment folder. So I'm actually going to redo this exact same virtual environment setup when we start our Django project, which of course we're not doing in this part. We're really just focusing on macOS setup here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory, and I'm going to call this PENV, and this is standing for Python environment, or VENV, which is another way to think of this as a virtual environment. But I'll go ahead and call it PENV, and we will go ahead and cd into PENV. Okay, so now if I list things out, I've got nothing in there. If I open it up, I still have nothing in there, right? And if I navigate back to a different folder, what I can see is it's inside of that dev folder. And again, I can go into my users folder here, navigate to that dev folder, and then navigate to that PENV folder, empty folder, completely empty. Okay. So here is where we actually create our virtual environment. We type out Python 3.6 -m as in -module, and then we use VENV. So this module does sound a lot like the folder name that we're about to use, but this is actually a way that Python has built into it. I think as soon as Python 3.4 or so, Python has a way built into it to keep our project's dependencies somewhat isolated. So what this is doing is it's going to say, hey, Python 3.6, create a virtual environment using the module of VENV, and we're going to do it in this folder by using this period here. Now, part of the reason I was opening up the current directory is to show you what that period does in other places. This is just a simple and easy way to do that right here. So I hit enter, and it's going to take a moment, and it seems like nothing happened. But now if I list everything out with ls, I see all of these different folders and file. This right here is a file, and these are folders. And of course, we can verify that by actually opening it up in the Finder, and we can see folders and file. There's another command that we can use, which is ls-al. This gives me a little bit better of what's going on with this, as well as certain permissions. That is definitely outside the scope of this one right here. But the general idea is there are other commands that are built in to the terminal or built into the command line that we're just not going to cover at this point. But what we need to do is, now that we've created a virtual environment, we need to actually activate that virtual environment. So I'll go ahead and do source bin/activate. And if I list things out in here, nothing seems to have changed. The only thing that really changed was this right here. So if I clear everything out by just typing out clear, I see that my virtual environment is active. Here is the biggest kicker that didn't happen on our machine before. If I type out Python-V and hit enter, notice the version of Python. It says 3.6.8. But if I open up a new terminal window and do Python-V, it gives me 2.7. So already it's showing us that this is isolated, and that's because I'm inside of this virtual environment. Now there's this whole other thing called pip, or the Python package installer, that should also be on your system now as well. So we can actually do something called pip freeze, and this will show us the packages that are installed. Now I'm actually not going to install any packages just yet. We will do that in a little bit. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this virtual environment. You can actually type out deactivate or even just close the window. And then I'm going to activate it again. So source bin/activate, we hit enter. What do you know? We're back in that virtual environment. And if I press up a few times on my keyboard, I can go back to that command of Python-V. So let's go ahead and deactivate that one more time. And this time I'm going to go ahead and type out Python-V, and I see, hey, what do you know? It's the wrong version of Python. So the coolest thing about the virtual environment part is when it is activated, it will have this right here. This is true with any virtual environment that's created by Python on any operating system. So if you jumped on a Windows, the actual command to activate the virtual environment is a little bit different, but the indication that you're in a virtual environment will be identical. So I am going to really emphasize that you need to use virtual environments because of one other thing. If I do this pip freeze command again on my machine, with my virtual environment not activated, what I'll see is a bunch of things that are actually installed. I see that Django is already installed. I never installed Django in this virtual environment. So this is actually showing me that my system has Django installed, but my virtual environment does not, as indicated right here. Now, if this is complicated at all, no worries. This is something that you'll get the hang of as you do it a little bit more. And you know what? Let's actually do it again. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clear everything out. We'll cd back a folder. So cd ... brings me back a folder. If I just do cd period, it does nothing. Similar to open period, we'll open up this directory. CDing into the same directory does nothing. So what I want to do is actually remove that PENV by typing it out with rm-rf PENV. Okay. So yeah, that's going to be removing that entire folder. Now, I just threw a bunch of commands at you, so perhaps you just want to delete it this way. You open up the directory, the dev folder directory, and you see PENV, and you just drag it into the trash. That's fine too. You can do it either way. The point is not to try and remember every command that you possibly can. The point is really to just understand how virtual environments work. So let's go ahead and create another one. Do you remember how it goes? In fact, I'm going to create another one, activate it, and just list everything out without saying anything else. Well, hopefully not saying anything else. Red flag should go off right there. Okay, so what happened here? A couple of things. Number one, we created a virtual environment, or seemingly created a virtual environment, and we changed into Django 3.2. Now, in my case, I actually think this folder already existed. So let's go ahead and deactivate it again. And I'm going to go ahead and try this one more time. And then we'll go ahead and do Python 3.6-m venv and pyenv 3. And this one takes a little bit longer. So we're going to cd into that one, source bin/activate, and Python -v. Great. Okay. So what the heck? I added this here. I didn't do that before. Well, this is actually a shortcut to making that directory. So what I did before was I cd into dev, I hit make dir, and we'll do pyenv4, and then I cd'd into pyenv4, and then I ran Python 3.6-m venv period. That is roughly the same thing. So these 3 lines, well, except for the cd part, but this actually creates the virtual environment in a folder called pyenv3. But I also showed you that if I already had a virtual environment created, in the case of DJ32, that already existed, and it actually already has a Django project in it. We will get into that in a little bit. But the idea is I tried to create a new virtual environment where one already existed. It did not override that virtual environment. So it is actually something we want to be careful about when we are creating virtual environments. But that's just the general rule of thumb of installing Python and doing a Python virtual environment setup. And of course, to cap it off, just remember that to deactivate, you can just write out deactivate. To activate, it's literally source bin/activate. I will come back to using source bin/activate over and over. But of course, if you're watching a Windows user, it's going to be something like scripts/activate. And I'll also usually mention those as well. It's just slightly different depending on what machine you're on. Once you have a virtual environment activated, you can now use that version of Python and any packages that are installed to it. Cool. Let's go ahead and keep going.